Thank you everyone for being here. Today, city departments and I will provide quick updates on Capitol Hill, but I'd like to largely focus on the continued work we are doing and must continue to do to live up to this moment in our nation's history and to meet the demands of community to reimagine policing and to invest in our communities. For weeks, we had peaceful demonstrations on Capitol Hill. While thousands have peacefully protested in the area over the last weeks, the public safety threats in recent weeks have been well documented. The multiple acts of gun violence have resulted in tragic deaths of 2 individuals, both of them teenagers. Multiple others were seriously wounded. For weeks, I have been consulting with city departments and particularly with Chief Best and Chief Scoggins on the best ways to reduce the number of people in the area, provide services to homeless individuals, reduce impacts to neighborhoods, and increase public safety. Despite our continued efforts to de-escalate and bring community messengers in, including personally having conversations with demonstrator organizations on Friday, the deteriorating conditions and repeated gun violence required us to immediately address public safety concerns. From conversations over the weekend, it was clear that many individuals would not leave and that the impacts to the community could not be reduced and public safety could not be improved until they did leave. An operation of this scope and magnitude takes significant resources and planning, particularly by the Seattle Police Department. Over the last 2 weeks, city departments and SPD, under Chief Best's leadership, have been devising a range of operational plans. I am very grateful for Chief Best's leadership and for SPD's work. For days, they have had to design and practice the operation that began this morning. So late last night, after consulting with Chief Best and my other departments, I issued an executive order asking city departments to work together to address public health and public safety concerns, as well as the sustained damage to Cal Anderson Park and the East Precinct area. I'm hoping to meet with the families of the gun victims so I can directly express my condolences for the loved ones they lost in those senseless acts of violence. I know they too have been on Capitol Hill. These acts of violence hurt our whole community, and they are also in direct contrast to the message ringing from the streets that Black Lives Matter. I will continue to refocus our energy on the hard but critical work to answer the voices demonstrating and demanding change, to reimagine with Chief Best what policing looks like in our city, and to invest in the true health and safety of our communities. No city, including Seattle, will dismantle centuries of systemic racism overnight. But we must act now. We must answer to history. I said from the onset that Capitol Hill has a rich history of being at the epicenter of protests and change. I marched and participated in many events on Capitol Hill, particularly for LGBTQ rights. Capitol Hill is the heart of the gay community. Cal Anderson Park is named for the first openly gay state legislator, and East Barbara Bailey Way that leads to the park is named for Barbara Bailey, a lifetime community leader and friend. But now that space has a new and shared history of civil rights. There is no question we must find a way to memorialize that history that has transpired there over the last month. Our parks and arts departments are actively working with the individuals who are maintaining the community garden and with artists to preserve their work. But we will also engage community, residents, and businesses on how we can memorialize the protests in the public realm, such as a new garden, a speaker's corner, or new art. For the many arrests this morning, I believe charges should not be filed against the individuals arrested only for misdemeanor obstruction, failure to disperse, or trespassing. I fully support SPD's operations this morning, and the arrests and bookings were appropriate. But as we move forward in healing, alternatives to charging and criminal sanctions are also important. In a moment, I'll speak more on how I am thinking our city priorities can answer community demands. But I want to speak briefly about the future of the East Precinct and Capitol Hill community. Part of rethinking policing should also be the long-term failures of how police and community resource are present in community. We need to have true community spaces with connections to community-based organizations, health clinics, and restorative justice programs. Capitol Hill was the entrance to the Central District, where Black community and communities of color can no longer call home. When I grew up, the Central District was about 75% African American. Today, it's less than 14%. Their histories, their shops, their homes, their gathering spots have largely been erased. But strong reminders of the work we have to do remain. One of our city's oldest churches, established in 1886, First AME, sits just a block from the East Precinct. I've been working and talking with Black leaders on a plan to create a space on Capitol Hill to support community voices in rethinking and reimagining policing and the greater investments we need to make in Black prosperity, health, and brilliance. These conversations are ongoing and must be led by community itself. We hope to have more to share on that soon. In addition, I want to thank again Reverend Harriet Walden for her leadership in reminding us of the importance of the East Precinct, whose history is rooted in Black-led organizing. In addition to resources in the budget, she will be leading outreach about long-term futures of the East Precinct. I truly believe we can reimagine the space, a shared space, including a community room in the East Precinct and things in and around Capitol Hill and the East Precinct. In order to move forward, we must recommit to the message that brought tens of thousands of residents from in and around the city to the streets, demanding change. We must remember that it was the unjust murder of George Floyd that ignited a global movement, including here in Seattle, calling for changes to policing, a concerted effort to undo centuries of systemic racism, and broad investments in community. I am committed to this work, and it's there where I spend and focus my energies. After meeting with community leaders and organizations, demonstrators, business, and residents in the last 3 weeks, and hearing their demands for change, my administration and I are focusing on key areas to address the systemic inequities in Seattle. First, investing in Black communities. Second, investing in young people. Third, rethinking and reimagining policing, including culture and budget. Last, accountability and reform, including statewide reforms of laws governing police unions and investigations. True public safety comes from a healthy and resilient community, and that's only possible if we invest in them. For the last year, we have been working to return legacy properties to the Black ownership. These include Bird Bar Place, formerly known as Camp, and the Central Area Senior Center. We've been in close communication with Africatown about them acquiring Fire Station 6. Last week, their architect in the city had a walkthrough of the facility, and we look forward to continued discussions. Community leaders have stated that the long process is part of the problem, and I agree. We are going to expedite it. I've also committed to investing $100 million in my 2021 budget directly into community investments focused on improving the lives of our BIPOC communities. We have to invest in young people and youth opportunities. We cannot achieve justice without educational justice. This truth is what guided our city on programs over the last 2 years of being mayor, including making free college for every Seattle high school student a reality, and ensuring that we have free transit passes to get them to and from school or anywhere in their city. As an intermediate action, as part of my budget rebalancing package, I committed $5 million for mentoring and summer learning for Black youth. My office has been working with DEAL and community stakeholders on a proposal to allocate those funds, and they should be ready to announce soon. Black youth are not just the future of their community, they're the future of Seattle. we must invest in that future. We will be rethinking and reimagining policing, including budgeting, and have been working very closely with Chief Best, who is one of the best leaders in this country on policing, and herself is committed to seeing that we can protect public safety and at the same time reimagine how our department does its work. This means deploying the right person with the right skills into a situation, and sometimes that's a mental health specialist, domestic violence counselor, or addiction counselor. We've created programs like this in Seattle to reduce 911 calls for service, including Seattle Fire Department's Health One, which is a mobile medical clinic that addresses low acuity situations. And nurses and social workers can show up. We've also added nurses to our homeless shelters, and we will continue to expand on programs like this. Creating, training, and building these new health-centered responses will not happen overnight, but we know what works, and more importantly, community knows what works. As an immediate step, tens of millions of dollars have been cut from SPD's budget, but Chief Best is conducting a deep review of the budget to assess what functions might be moved to other departments and what the core functions of the department are. She and I will never compromise public safety, but we believe we can reimagine policing and invest in community. Let's lead the nation, Seattle, and show how this work can be done. In addition to making SPD's budget transparent, I'm committed by finding more ways to partner with the community to ensure that they have a say in what policing looks like in our city. BIPOC communities have been left behind for far too long, and it's imperative that our budget reflect our commitment to investing in those communities. Undoing centuries of systemic racism will not happen overnight, as I've said before. But I do believe Seattle can lead the way in addressing injustices and ensuring everyone, regardless of their race, can achieve their full potential. Racism is hardwired into our institutions and permeates almost every aspect of our society. We can only begin to undo the trauma and injustice by centering the voices of the people who have been most impacted. What I'm committed to doing is putting in the work and working with community to creating that true, lasting, generational change that this time in history demands of all of us. I ask the rest of Seattle to join me in that. And now I'll give you Chief Best.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mayor Durkan. I want to start off first by thanking the men and women of the Seattle Police Department for their work in the East Precinct this morning. We've had a tremendous citywide effort today. Hundreds of police officers from Seattle and our mutual aid partners from Bellevue and from the Washington State Patrol focused on one task: peacefully assisting with the long and difficult job of cleaning up these streets. Since 5 o'clock this morning, we've made over 36 arrests for failure to disperse, obstruction, assaults, and unlawful weapon possession, and a few other crimes. If you have watched the news footage, you have seen how absolutely devastating the damage to this neighborhood is. I can tell you personally, after walking through the area, we walked the full perimeter, I was just stunned by the number of, the amount of graffiti, garbage, and property destruction. As we walked around the neighborhood, many people were coming out of their apartments and homes and thanking the officers profusely for being there and for helping to clean out the area. So we don't even know how much trauma people were experiencing because of what was happening in that area. Our officers are now inside at the East Precinct, surveying the damage and assessing when we'll be able to return to the building and to return to serving the people in the area. I want to have our officers back in the precinct so we can reduce the call times for 911 responses to calls for service and be more receptive to the needs of the neighborhood. I want to close by saying A big part of the work before us is creating a framework, a plan for what community safety will look like in Seattle from here on out. I have heard the demands for change. I agree change must happen, but this is nothing we can do alone. We need to re-envision community safety together. This isn't about reform and outlines mandated by a court. This is about humanity. This is about breaking down systemic racism and letting the community lead the effort for reconciliation and for peace between community and police. And following will be Sam Zimbabwe from SDOT.
Thank you. Sam Zimbabwe, the Director of the Seattle Department of Transportation. Just very briefly, our activities today, starting a little bit before 7, we had crews on the ground, about 35 to 40 people overall throughout the day, removing the traffic control that was there, concrete barriers, other signs that had been installed to change the traffic pattern and resetting the traffic pattern as it had been previously. That went very successfully. All of the concrete barriers that had been there before have been removed. We have installed some concrete barriers to create a safe perimeter around the East Precinct, just immediately adjacent to the curb lane. I'll also talk very briefly about our next steps with regards to art and art that was produced in the protest zone. We've been working with the CHOP Council and artists that had produced art in the area as we were taking apart barriers and disassembling what was up there. We worked with artists to secure that, bring it off-site so it can be secured. The city does not have is not taking ownership of that in any way. We're trying to facilitate the next steps with community around what can be done, how that can be repurposed, how that can be something that's shared. We are not seeking to take ownership at all of art and have sought to preserve and protect that. We have secured what was there, brought it to a secure off-site location. And I think I will turn it over to Jason Johnson from the Human Services Department.
Good afternoon, Jason Johnson with the Human Services Department. The city's Human Services Department has been on the ground, outside and inside the area and vicinity around the East Precinct and Cal Anderson Park since June 23rd, since last Tuesday. We're there to support the city's ongoing efforts to keep the area safe. Starting last Tuesday, HSD organized a service resource hub on Pine and Broadway, which served as an outreach staging area to place people directly and connect them to services. This is in addition to outreach being done inside of the CHOP area. HSD is continuing this outreach today, following the closure of Cal Anderson Park and the areas outside of the East Precinct. We want to make sure that we're engaging with people that may still be outside of the perimeter. The area in and around Cal Anderson Park has historically been an area where unsheltered individuals stay overnight. We also know that a number of individuals who came to be part of the movement and have their voices heard were experiencing housing instability. This sustained outreach effort began following conversations between city leadership as well as community leaders and organizers to ensure that community members and demonstrators had access to services. And I want to thank all of these stakeholders for their engagement to bring social services to people in need in that area. The navigation team has been, as I mentioned, engaged since last Tuesday. And through yesterday, they were able to make 148 engagements with unhoused individuals. They were able to make 30 referrals to shelter, connect 26 individuals to other service providers, and provided diversion services, which got 17 individuals into hotels. These figures don't include any of the activities today, but provide a snapshot of the kind of services that were made available to individuals experiencing homelessness in the area throughout the week. Outreach staff also made travel arrangements, provided basic needs such as bottled water and food. Also made sure that people had access to dry clothing. We had a number of community-based organizations that were also part of this effort. Mary's Place, Evergreen Treatment Services, Youth Care, Teen Feed, Public Health, Country Doctor, and others were on site to make sure that people had what they needed. On Saturday, HSD coordinated services with DESC's mobile crisis team to work on site at the CHOP, providing behavioral health outreach and service support. The mobile crisis team can refer people to shelter and offer limited cash assistance funding provided by the Human Services Department to provide hotel stays or travel vouchers to home communities, and make sure that there are important connections to behavioral health services. While the executive order issued today directed multiple city departments to safely close the area around the East Precinct and Cal Anderson Park, this was not a navigation team led effort or a encampment removal activity. However, throughout the week, HSD directed its navigation team, outreach staff, to focus solely on outreach to this area. Outreach workers had access to city-funded shelters, such as tiny house villages, enhanced shelters, de-intensification shelters at some city facilities, as well as the recently reopened City Hall shelter. All resources generally reserved for the navigation team outreach. On average, the outreach specialists were out in the field with around 53 available shelter beds every day. In closing, HSD remains committed to supporting communities during their time of need. We saw great need in this area. It's why we wanted to be engaged. It's why we continued to be engaged even today. I want to thank the organizers, leaders, community members, and city staff who stayed in communication and coordination with one another throughout the demonstration and throughout the departments and city efforts. Because of these cooperative efforts, people were connected to shelter, received services, and at the very least were connected to someone who cared and could help them navigate. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't introduce you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jesús Aguirre. I'm the Superintendent of Seattle Parks and Recreation. So this morning, after the other agencies did some of their work, Seattle Parks and Recreation crews went into the park to continue the work of cleaning, begin assessing the damage, and begin some of the repair in the park. In addition to that, we supported the removal of some of the supplies and equipment that were set up in the kitchen area by some organizers there. We supported moving that to an offsite location controlled by those folks. Also worked with the gardening organizers to secure some of the plantings there. We're actually going to be storing some of the plants in our greenhouse as we begin a discussion about a permanent presence for a garden at Cal Anderson. Over the coming days, we're going to continue our work, cleaning, removing graffiti, assessing the damage, repairing some of the damage that's been done to the park, doing some landscape maintenance, irrigation repair, et cetera, and also working closely with SPU to assess any infrastructure, any remediation to the infrastructure over the reservoir. As we move forward, as I mentioned, we have had a chance to work with the gardening organizers, Marcus Henderson, on a couple of occasions, and we're going to continue to have discussions with him and others about establishing a permanent presence there, jointly with Parks and Recreation, as well as with the Department of Neighborhoods, who operates a P-patch system in the city. In addition, as we continue to remove graffiti, we're also working, as Sam said, to preserve any of the art that's in the park, and again, look for opportunities to ensure that can remain. Specifically, there's a mural that was painted in the bathroom, a Black Lives Matter mural that we're going to keep there. We'll continue to work with the Art Council to support that. And then, as the mayor said, in the coming days, we're going to be working with various stakeholders, community members, to ensure that there is some continued presence in the park that recognizes the efforts of the protesters, the efforts of the Black Lives Matter organization, and we look forward to working with community members on that. So.
Thank you. I want to note again, this shows just a part of what went into this morning, but over the last 3 weeks, Almost every city department was touched in some ways by either supporting protesters, trying to mitigate damages, trying to provide services. It was always a very fluid situation in that area. And in talking to Chief Best and others, we worked very purposefully over the last weeks to make sure that those who were there for protest could exercise their First Amendment rights. But then as things started to change, we saw many of the protesters leave, and with large national attention, other people attracted to the area. It was really important for us to reduce the footprint, to reduce the number of people there, to provide them services consistently, and then to work across all our departments to make sure that this was never going to be just a Seattle Police Department effort. As you saw today, it required so many departments from the city of Seattle to not just restore the area, but to make sure that the people in the park had the services they need, that we did consistent outreach, and that we had a range of support for everything from Santa cans from SPU to City Light having to check to see if power was cut, to the facilities people having to come and repair some of the building damage. So this has been an all effort by every department. But I particularly, Chief Scoggins isn't here, couldn't be here, but I want to thank him and Chief Best for their very strong leadership over the last 3 weeks, but even before that, throughout the pandemic. But it has been Chief Best who has had a very steady hand, and her team. I can't thank the Seattle Police Department and the officers of the police department today for their work. We saw very volatile situations last week where other city departments could not respond because of the volatility of the area, and that meant that Seattle Police Department had to take a greater role. So I want to thank them for that, and with that, we'll take some questions.
Mayor, one moment, please. Just as a reminder, Mayor, I will let you first address some questions in the room, then we will go to people on the WebEx, and then we'll come back to you.
2 in the room, 2 on the web.
That sounds great.
Sounds good.
Hi, Mayor. We heard from some people who say the city is ultimately responsible for the loss of life, for not stepping in quicker to clear it. What regrets do you have in how the city has handled this?
I think I deeply, deeply regret the loss of life, and as I said, I want to meet with the families to express my condolences. We'll have lots of opportunity to do after actions on what people could have done at what junctures. As you saw this morning, an operation of this scope and magnitude takes very careful planning across many departments. And with the number of people who had been in that area previously, we would not have been able to do this operation. If you have thousands of people in there, it's a very different operation than if you have 100 or fewer.
You know, a number of business owners within the CHOP area have been quite frustrated at how long it has taken to what we saw this morning. I'm wondering if you can address that and maybe talk about some of the financial support that might be available to them, especially knowing that they've obviously seen a great impact because of the COVID-19 crisis leading up to the CHOP zone creation.
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was a lot of the businesses in the area had already been suffering impacts because of the COVID-19 closures, and this created more impacts upon them. What kind of financial resources would be available? Very important. I've met with business and residents, and we're going to do a number of things. One, I've talked to my Office of Economic Development to see what resources we can provide to businesses as quickly as we can to support them. In addition, I've been talking to the City Attorney's Office to see if we can do expedited payment of any smaller tort claims so that if people have lost revenues, they're damaged to property and the like, that we can pay those on a very quick and expedited basis with as little paperwork as possible. Obviously, some of the larger claims that have been filed in court may take longer for the lawyers, but I want those businesses to get what they need to reopen and stay open. I heard very clearly from them the pain of seeing their businesses closed, the graffiti on the walls, calling back their employees, but not yet able to open. Preview of coming attractions, we're seeing the numbers of COVID cases go up significantly in Seattle and King County. And so we know that having businesses operate safely is critical to them and their workers, so I'm going to do everything I can to mitigate the impacts for those businesses.
Thank you, Mayor. Our first question today will come from Sydney Brownstone, Seattle Times, followed by Justin Carter, Capitol Hill, Seattle. Sydney, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anthony. Yes, my question is for Mayor Durkan. Do you bear any responsibility for the deaths of the 2 teenagers at the CHOP over the last 2 weeks?
So as I said, I think that it is deeply regretful what happened to the 2 people who were killed as well as the 2 people in the hospital. I want to make sure that I can meet with those parents, express my condolences, and also say that I think that there's many ways in which the city of Seattle could be better. We don't know yet enough about those shootings to determine exactly who did it, but it should never happen in the city of Seattle.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will be from Justin Carter, Capitol Hill, Seattle. Justin, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. And this is for the mayor. So this morning, we again saw many officers with their badge numbers covered. Is it time for you to send a stronger message about what the community expects and demands from its police force?
I don't know about I'm going to let Chief Best answer that question because I'm not aware of what was happening in the field. But we've made very clear what the rule is for Seattle Police Department, and she'll address that.
Yeah, certainly. Is that Justin that was asking the question? Hi, Justin. We will make sure we follow up on that. Badge numbers, as you know, have been legislated and should not be covered at any time by the morning band. So if that occurred, we will make sure that we follow up on it. We have plenty of video, lots of body-worn camera that was out there, and many media, and so we will make sure that we follow up on that, but the rules have not changed. So thank you for inquiring, and I'll make sure that I follow up.
Great. Thank you very much, Chief, and thank you, Mayor. Our next question will come from Lily Fowler, Crosscut, followed by Hannah Scott, Cairo Radio. Lily? Lily, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. This question is for Mayor Durkan. Just wondering what she makes of the statement that was released today by Attorney General William Barr praising the action that took place this morning. And then I think Trump's spokesperson also said something about restoring order.
So thank you for the question, Lily. I think I've made it clear from the outset that I don't think that the president or his administration's comments have been helpful. In fact, there's no question that they have made the situation more volatile, including some threats on Facebook that some patriots would come this 4th of July to liberate the area. I think that's made it more difficult. I would urge the Attorney General to restore lawfulness to Pennsylvania Avenue.
Hannah? Hannah, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you both. This is for both Mayor Durkan and Chief Best, either who would like to weigh in. This morning, as the CHOP area was being cleared out, I heard many of the protesters who did eventually leave peacefully promising that they would be back. What, if anything, is being done to ensure that they don't return and try to set up again, either at the park or up on Pine near the East Precinct, as well as anywhere else in the city?
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for that question. First, let me just start by saying that we respect everyone's right for First Amendment free speech. So if they want to come back, if anybody wants to protest and do so peacefully and exercise their right, we certainly encourage that. What we can't have is what we saw there, an area where people were entrenched, where crimes and lawlessness were occurring, where people were being assaulted, raped, robbery, and as you know, 2 murders. So there's no situation or circumstance that I can see where as a police chief I would condone that kind of behavior going on in any part of the city at any time, which is one of the reasons that when we were able to get a good plan in place, we operated on it. So again, we support people's First Amendment free speech rights, but we certainly can't condone or promote lawlessness in any area of the city.
Thank you, Chief. Our next question will be from Simone Del Rosario, Q13 News, followed by David Douglas, NBC News. Simone, the floor is yours.
I'd like to follow up on what Hannah was talking about there for the mayor or for the chief. There's conversation on the ground about moving the occupation elsewhere. What will the city's response be if these protesters decide to occupy elsewhere? Will you allow them to set up camp like they did outside the East Precinct, as long as there's not that lawlessness that the chief just mentioned?
So again, I want to echo what the chief said, is we strongly support the First Amendment rights to protest, and we have seen that in Seattle over the last 3 weeks, where tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets, sometimes in one march, and we will be guided by each situation as it presents itself. We will support the right of free speech, but we will not support the right of people who are creating a situation like we had on Capitol Hill that ended up in violence and disorder in the way that it did.
Thank you, Mayor. Our next question will be from David Douglas, NBC News, followed by Kara Kostanich, Homo 4. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to just echo my colleague's question from previous mayor and ask what you would do if there is another attempt at an occupation in the city, and also ask, you noticed the K-rail traffic barrier that's gone up to line the corner that defines East Precinct here on Capitol Hill. Are you preparing Chief Best to have to defend the precinct for some time to come when protesters inevitably return?
So I think those are three questions, but let's see, I'll let Chief Best ask the one. But look, every protest situation and act of civil disobedience, we respond to as the circumstances allow and permit. And so it's hard to predict with every hypothetical. We've had all sorts of protests in Seattle, just not over the last 3 weeks, but over many years. And so we will be guided by what the situation on the ground is. And Chief Best and her troops have been trained strongly in how to respond, and if it affects other city departments, we will look at that time. We've had protests, for example, almost every evening at the West Precinct, which, other than some property damage cases, have gone on and has not required operations like we saw today. So we will be guided by what the circumstances are. What was the next question? We don't anticipate at this point. We think that with the streets open, we're hopeful that Seattle, Capitol Hill can return to normal, that businesses can open, that everyone can enjoy that park. It's going to take us some time to restore the park and actually reopen the park. So I think that I will let the chief address what their plans are for the East Precinct.
Yeah, in the short term, the mayor's order is still in effect for the next 10 days, and people are not allowed in the area that are not residents or business owners into the area, as we effect some precinct cleanup and some street closure cleanup and other things that are occurring both with our FAS, SDOT, Parks Department, Human Services, and some of the folks who are here at the press conference. So we're going to be working with everybody to make sure that we open up the area. You know, you choose the word inevitable. I don't know that that's necessarily accurate. That's certainly your assumption. But we do know, again, that we support people's First Amendment free speech right, that we're going to make sure that we try to expedite and help people in that process. But again, if people hunker in and there's lawlessness, you know, then we have to react and respond. And I think that's what you're really asking. And like I said before, and I'll repeat, and there's not going to be a situation ever as a police chief where we're going to be okay with illegal acts in the city. So we're going to work really hard to make sure that we keep all of our community safe that lives there.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief. Our next question will be from Kara Kostanich, followed by our final question from Rachel Abrams at New York Times. Kara, the floor is yours.
And this is a question following up on a couple of other questions we've heard. Chief Best, can you specifically address what the plan will be for protecting the East Precinct or other SPD facilities to make sure they aren't targeted again? Perhaps will you have boots on the ground outside these facilities?
Well, certainly we're going to have additional presence in and around the East Precinct and other areas. Is, as the mayor said earlier, we're going to respond as the situation presents itself to us in the best way that we can to make sure that we provide public safety to everyone involved. So that generally is the plan. In some cases that might mean additional resources. In some cases it may not. So all of that is going to be determined based on what we're presented with in the area. We do know, and it's been, I confirmed earlier that we did get some indication information from the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that there were threats to precincts, to police precincts, and to government facilities. And certainly we're taking all of that very seriously. I know there was a question about that. So we verified that, and that information came from our local special agent in charge of the FBI. So we're always keeping a watchful eye for any potential threat to any of our facilities at all times.
Thank you very much, Chief. And it seems as though our last question has been withdrawn, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Mayor, if you have any closing thoughts for us.
Again, I want to thank the city departments who worked not just this morning, but over the last several weeks to really provide a level of services to support protesters, to try to create public safety. We saw as the area deteriorated, particularly at night, we needed a different response. We tried different responses, and it was clear that we could not restore the area and have the level of public safety we needed until the protesters were moved and the streets were open. I want to also thank all of the people who raised their voices in protest to challenge our city, our state, and our country to be better. If all we remember from the last few weeks is what happened in those few blocks on Capitol Hill, we've missed the point. We've missed the point entirely. The murder of Mr. Floyd ignited a movement across the globe. But that movement was because of years and centuries of systemic racism. It resonated in the bones of so many people. And here in Seattle, we saw for the first time many people standing up loudly to stand with their black neighbors to say, enough is enough. We must do better. I've heard that, I believe it, and as mayor, that will be my focus, to make those changes, to dismantle the systemic racism, to build hope, and to build true community safety by investing in those communities and making every person part of that dream that Dr. Martin Luther King had for us all. Thank you very much.